a Beijing correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and a very distinguished one he was too. And he's shortly going to return to North Asia for the Fairfax newspapers, which is really good news for those of us who've seen some of the foreign coverage in those papers sort of falling away a bit. So we're delighted, John, that you're going back there, and we're really delighted that you're here tonight to join us. And so, John Garnaut.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure and a privilege. Look, I don't know if I'm going to get to Northeast Asia, as Colin suggested. It depends on how Fairfax's share price goes over the next few weeks. I'll be based in Melbourne and hopefully do a little bit of travelling, but trying to broaden my interest in China to the region. So, look, I spent 6 years in China as correspondent for. Hands off the mic. Oh, sorry, it's not my mic. I shouldn't have touched it. So I spent 6 years in Beijing, and the story that I was discovering, and it's not what I set out to discover, was really the putrefaction of the Chinese party state. It was the corruption that was actually corroding how power worked. It was a system that's designed for dictators when there was no dictator. It was bureaucracies driving the centre. It was an organism without a nucleus. It was something much messier and much, I think, less stable than I had assumed when I'd first arrived. Now, I left in mid last year, and I think that was still probably, my assessment when I left, but I think political time in China started pretty much, T0 from about September last year. And as they say in the mob, you're not really a leader until you've killed. And when Xi Jinping took care of Bo Xilai in September last year, I think that really was the beginning of a new era in Chinese politics. I've touched the mic again, I'm really sorry, whoever it is. He stepped forward after destroying Bo Xilai. The way he did it set up really his ascendency. He showed his colours. Lots of people, except really, families that knew him well, were saying, look, all we can do is guess who he is because of who his father was. And lots of people had a lot of confidence in various ways because of that. But he'd never shown his colours really until September last year. All of a sudden he walked onto the stage. He not only took down Bo Xilai kind of harder than people had expected, he began dismantling the world's biggest, baddest company, PetroChina, the world's biggest, baddest security apparatus run by Zhou Yongkang, and now we see even the former vice chairman of the Central Military Committee who controlled the PLA for 10 years, Xu Caiho, and various others. Up until that stage, I'd never seen a corruption campaign that was actually directed at corruption rather than various kind of politics. But this, he bridged the two. His corruption campaign has, if I was to kind of nominate my list of, the biggest, baddest, worstest guys in China, he's pretty much taken down most of them, and the others are pinned against the wall. And this has also been, inextricable from his rise to power. Now that he's got the tiger head sort of sitting on a post of all these various tigers, which petrol company or bank would kind of or provincial leader or disregard central orders now in a way that they've kind of happily done over the last 10 years. So we're in a new era. I think if there's one defining trait about the new guy, Xi Jinping, it is that he is a guy that's not afraid to take risks. He's a guy that's actually not even afraid to fail, which is a completely different political mindset to what we saw before, for all sorts of various reasons, which I'll go into. So now I've kind of given you the answer. I'll try and let you know how I got there. Now, have I got a little pointy thing? All right, cool. So there's the dictator as a young boy, Xi Jinping, and his old man Xi Jinping. So these guys were rehabilitated in 1978. That's just after they got. Xi Jinping had spent most of his life in purgatory at that stage. Now they're into the new world of opening and reform. I'll just touch another screen. Thank you. That's my kind of my working summary of where we're at. He is a stickler for process, for party process. This, as distinct from various other processes, this means that you inherit the policy platform that you nut out with your predecessors. He walked in. He walks onto the job the day after the 18th Party Congress. It's the 18th Party Congress, the old mob, that lays out the policy platform. He's been implementing that as it was given to him, with the difference being that he's done it, more, he's done it with kind of steroids and jet fuel and various other kind of growth supplements. He's just doing it far harder and faster, these various programs that were going nowhere before, for better or for worse. This is not a moral judgment, this is just a judgment that whatever his task is to do, he's starting to get it done. His first task is I think to restore some sort of belief. They use the word faith often. It's almost a religious thing. Dating all the way back to Yan'an, you don't believe in really an outcome, you believe in an entity, and you believe that it's going to keep rising, and his job first and foremost is to restore faith that the party is always going to be in charge of China, and China, with the party in control, is inexorably rising. And so anybody that hasn't jumped on board, you know where the good money is going to be. Part of that is territorial. I'll leave this for the question and answer afterwards. I'm really looking forward to that. But part of it is territorial, that he's not changing priorities, but he's doubling the stakes and tripling the time frame, sort of accelerating the time frame in which he's trying to achieve territorial, in their words, the reclamation of ancient Chinese claims in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and potentially elsewhere. He's deepening sovereignty also in other borderlands, and incredibly accelerated timetable in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang and Tibet. It's a very nebulous thing. The idea of a Chinese state is a very nebulous thing and potentially extends into Chinese communities elsewhere. So this extends into the economic field too. Again, I won't go into my projections, but if there's risks to be taken for the goal of regime preservation, then he's the guy that I think is going to take them. So how did they get there? Well, it begins really with the fact that these guys were brought up tougher than any politician that we've ever been familiar with. These are the guys who, Xi Jinping was, he was born in 1953. Xi Jinping is 13 years old when he's watching his old man being paraded around on the back of a truck. This one's in Xi'an, so the kids were in Beijing. But Xi Jinping was kidnapped from his factory where he was doing thought reform through labour. In Henan province, he was taken by Red Guards to Xi'an. He was put in front of a whole bunch of criticism sessions, big wooden, sometimes metal racks around his head, head thrust forward, arms forced backwards, sometimes dislocated, and all sorts of abuse being thrown at you, and much, much worse going on behind closed doors. I mean, one of my really more surprising discoveries as I researched these guys is, we actually don't know the half of it. We think of the Cultural Revolution as being about, the public throwing a few tomatoes, and really the worst happened behind closed doors. It was a not as dissimilar as people think to the Stalin's Great Terror in 1930s Russia, and Xi Jinping went through all of that, but the difference to some of his compatriots is he fell earlier. So the whole family fell very early in the piece, 3 or 4 years before the Cultural Revolution proper, and that was Xi Jinping's entire formative experience. It was being smashed, humiliated, himself, his mother, his father, his siblings, his elder sister committed suicide, as they used to say in the Cultural Revolution. Anybody who survived that, it's almost like a kind of post-Holocaust survivor mentality. They stick together and nothing scares them afterwards. Now, in that this photo is taken in the same month, January 1967, this time at the Beijing Workers' Stadium. The last one was Xi Jinping, father of Xi Jinping. This is Bo Xilai, father of Bo Xilai. So these guys had a lot of differences over their lives, really going back to the 1930s, but for this brief moment in time, they were both in it together. So they've had very similar formative experiences, Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping. Where does it all begin? Look, Xi Jinping, or his father, represents, I think of Communist Party history as having two main traditions. One is the rural guerrilla Red Army, the group that Mao Zedong sort of likes people to think that he was, working with the peasants, redistributing lands, but very rural-based, very horizontal, non-hierarchical. It was a long way from party centre. It was a long way from the Soviet Comintern, and that's where Xi Jinping was hanging out in northwest China in these rural areas, North Shanxi. Whereas Bo Xilai came from a very different tradition. He came from the white areas, as they call it, the urban underground with Liu Shaoqi. This is all about kind of sneaking around in shadows, cloak and dagger, kind of united front. It's all about trust, and it was all about very, very close patronage relationships. That's how you lived or you died, depending on your close personal relationships. So that's a very different ethos, I think. Very different backgrounds that they have. Bo Xilai has to, mix in the shadows with KMT generals, with the intelligentsia of Beijing, whereas Xi Jinping's out sitting with the peasants and trying to get things to work on, in micro levels, but kind of get little economies working much closer to the people which they purport to serve. Oh, sorry, one more thing. And the first time Xi Jinping met Mao, sort of met Mao, it was just after Long March, and Xi Jinping was in a predicament, as he was often in his life. This particular time, he had been arrested and was just being tortured and was about to be buried alive by his factional opponents from the white area, which was actually the North China Bureau, which Bo Xilai was just starting out with at that stage in 1935. So probably Xi Jinping wouldn't have known Bo Xilai in those early days. It wasn't really Bo Xilai's fight, but by the time the People's Republic came around, and this whole kind of red versus white, the guerrilla tradition versus the urban white apparatus really was smashed together. I mean, Mao Zedong loved to kind of orchestrate these things as well, but for these guys it was very real. And the first great conspiracy with Mao's backing of the People's Republic was Xi Jinping supporting his mentor at the time, his patron Gao Gang, in trying to take down the leaders of the white areas, trying to reclaim control of the party apparatus with the belief that this is not, it was their revolution. These are the guys who were sitting with the peasants and expanding territory out in northwest China and elsewhere. It was not Bo Xilai and these fellows sitting in their kind of Comintern cells in the cities, yet the white area, the urban underground, the urban guys got all the pole positions, got all the best seats in the new People's Republic. So Xi Jinping was on board with the conspiracy of his patron Gao Gang, and his chief first target was Bo Xilai. And it looked like that Xi Jinping and his guys were going to successfully pull down Bo Xilai and start to pull apart this white area urban underground faction, and then it all went pear-shaped. Xi Jinping's patron, Gao Gang, committed suicide the following year. Very, very important moment in the Xi family's life. And, if you're going to talk about the relationship between Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping and their children today, pretty hard to forget that Xi Jinping was the guy who tried to destroy Bo Xilai in 1953. So, Bo Xilai, I've talked about the toughness of Xi Jinping. Bo Xilai is every bit that tough. He sat in a KMT jail in the 1930s. ran underground cells there. He was arrested in the Cultural Revolution, 1966. By then, really the white area guys, Bo Xilai, Liu Shaoqi, they were the main targets of the Cultural Revolution. They got a horrific time, just like Xi Jinping, but possibly worse in the Cultural Revolution. Tortured, deprived of water during the summer, deprived of clothes and blankets during the winter. Dislocated arms. There were occasions where he couldn't even sign his own confession. About as horrific conditions as you can imagine. Doctors that were not there to cure you. They went through it all. He was in jail for about 10 years or so during the Cultural Revolution. And different to Xi Jinping, so was Bo Xilai's children. His 3 sons were locked up in a rehabilitation thought reform camp, really the sole aim of which was to get them to denounce their parents. The conditions were horrific. They were all half-starved, often beaten, sometimes tortured. That was Bo Xilai's formative experience, late adolescence, out of school, straight into jail, and then he gets out, in the dying days of the Cultural Revolution, and then after the Cultural Revolution, all these guys are suddenly released into a new world, and they've got a lot of time to catch up. They're in a hurry. So they've obviously come from similar spots. Both Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai are leading princelings. Their fathers are among the founding fathers of the revolution. They've got a lot in common. They've known each other since the 1980s. And there have been moments when Xi Jinping's given Bo Xilai reason to believe that they are very good mates. If you go, some of you may have visited Bo Xilai's private office in Chongqing. I don't know if the British mission got to do that, but they on his wall there's photos of Bo Xilai and Xi Jinping arms around each other from the 80s. My own view, talking to family members, is that they might have been kind of close in all sorts of ways, but they never trusted each other. But in 2010, when Xi Jinping was first promoted to become vice chairman of the military commission, when his path was first set, the first thing he did was go to Chongqing, which he's doing in this photo, and he was and blew sunshine about Bo Xilai. I think his quote was, Bo Xilai's Strike Black and Sing Red campaign, which I'm sure all of you have heard about, his revolutionary songs and his anti-mafia campaign. They have brought joys to people's heart, I think was Xi Jinping's comment, which took up the front page of the Chongqing Daily and a modest 20-minute segment on the primetime evening news in Chongqing, none of which can be found anywhere in Chinese cyberspace anymore. But I talked about the clashes of the 1950s. The clash that still resonates today is when Xi Jinping, after he was released from his labour camp, he was sent to Guangdong, then brought back to Beijing. The guy that rehabilitated his family, I mean, there's probably 2 of them you can think of, but the main one was arguably Hu Yaobang. This is the guy in the white coat down the front. Some of you will remember him fondly, Jocelyn and people like that who were in Beijing in the mid-80s. Hu Yaobang was an exceptional character. There's been certainly nothing like him since, possibly nothing like him beforehand either. If ever there was a liberal leader in Chinese politics and an incorruptible one, it was Hu Yaobang. And when Hu Yaobang was appointed to be the General Secretary, ostensibly the party chief of China, but with all the old guys sitting over his head, the guy that he recruited to be the executive director of his central secretariat was Xi Jinping. So Hu Yaobang and Xi Jinping were very tight. The Xi family has a huge debt to pay to the family of Hu Yaobang. Xi's family and Hu's family are still very close today. And the bit of information you've all got to kind of remember is in 1987, when it was time to purge Hu Yaobang, he'd gone too far. The elders were cranky that the students weren't more grateful about the benefits they'd received. Hu Yaobang was purged in a meeting that went for 6 days, called a Democratic Party Life meeting. And the guy who chaired that meeting was Bo Xilai's father. So Bo Xilai's father gets his revenge in a way. After all those years, he's a spear carrier that brings down the the saviour of the Xi family in 1987. And that clash, and once again, roughly along those old factional lines, the white urban apparatus versus the guys with the more military or guerrilla backgrounds. I think that still animates the factional lines today, and the winners of this clash became the kingmakers in 1989, and it was really the alliance between Bo Xilai and his conservative elders and the new guy Jiang Zemin, which defined politics for the next 20 years, really. Now, sorry about the quality of this, but these are the children of those guys that I was talking about. Their fathers were the ones that destroyed Huyabang in 1987. These are the guys that Xi Jinping had to spend the last 30 years becoming chummy with. They're on the other side of the factional, historical, and in the 80s, the ideological divide. Just, you might recognise some people there. There's, there's poor quality, I acknowledge that. But on the, there's Xi Jinping there in the middle row, slightly to the right. Down the front now, Chen Yuan, the son of Chen Yuan, he arrived late and he kicked out Hu Chamul's son, who was very cranky about it. So the guy in pole position, front and centre, is Chen Yuan, who was then running the China Development Bank. On the top left is Kung Dan, he was at that stage running the CITIC conglomerate. His father happened to be the guy that signed the arrest warrant for Xi Jinping in 1935. Next to Kung Dan is Qin Xiao, also on the top left, who at that stage was running the China Merchants Bank. So there, in just one sentence, one photograph, you got the heads of three of the world's biggest financial institutions sitting around a table together in a banquet that had been organised by Xi Jinping just before his elevation in 2006. So he went out of his way to cultivate the children of his father's enemies. It goes on. There's the son of Peng Zhen. There's the son of Liu Shaoqi. There's 2 3-star generals in that photo, and they were pretty much all, not naturally aligned to Xi Jinping. So he has been very patiently working away for 30 years to stitch together the kind of trust that was required to get the backing of Jiang Zemin and these old conservative families to topple the candidate of Hu Jintao, Li Keqiang, and become the top leader after the 18th Party Congress at the end of 2012. This was the story up until very recently. China was, it was the centrifugal forces that were defining China. It was the factions, 2 centres for a system that's designed for one dictator. People were loyal to their patrons, not to the official party apparatus. In that environment of split leadership, that allowed an ideological debate to take hold, and the spear carriers, of course, or the flag bearers, as we know, were Bo Xilai representing the red flag, and Premier Wen Jiabao on the other side representing liberal values, or as they call it, universal values. This, very, very heated debate took root only in the last 3 or 4 years in a system that's not used to ideological debate. The whole point of having a Communist Party is that they define the ideology for you. As well as that, we saw people splitting into their family groups, their factional groups, and their money groups. We saw the prevalence of purchasing posts in the military, in the bureaucracy, and this was reaching very, very, very high up the party apparatus. So it was almost like the mafia. It was the mafiaization of large parts of the Chinese party states. This was China over the last 10 years. And it was a system where the bureaucracies, the state-owned enterprises, were setting policy. If you want to know how the origins of China's go out and invest overseas policy, you could probably trace it to Petro-China retrospectively looking for a justification to go to Sudan in the 1990s. It's this sort of thing where there was no forceful direction being set from the centre, and in the absence of that, it was every bureaucracy or state-owned corporation or agency or military unit to themselves. And so Xi Jinping, there was nothing, apart from who his father was, being the protege of Hu Yaobang in the 80s and having a very proud revolutionary background. Apart from his father, there's very little that could be seen to predict, to give us a prediction of where Xi Jinping was going to go. If you look at his family, it's not that different from the average revolutionary family. There's the old man before he died, Xi Jinping in the front there, the matriarch who holds the family together, Qi Xin, on the left of your photograph, and in the back you've got Xi Jinping, the good kid rising up the ranks and emulating his father, and then you've got all the rest. There's the younger brother, Yuan Ping, who's making a dick of himself in all sorts of enterprises. There's Chow Chow, who, as Bloomberg told us last year, had accumulated wealth, if you add it all up, well in excess of $1 billion. Very little of that was known to anybody before that extraordinary investigation. These are very rich people. So in the same family, we've got Xi Jinping purporting to represent the revolutionary heritage of his father. His sister and his brother are out, making an absolute mozza out of the same family name. So there was some reason to think that the patterns that I've been talking about would continue, that we're still in this extraordinary new age of an information revolution, and some real experts in this crowd, notably Feng Chongyi, about how, wherever you are, how Chinese society, I could see it just transforming in front of my eyes over the 6 years in which I was in China. The difference between the people I left and the people I arrived to see was, I think it was a difference between a virtual civil society had been constructed in that period, where people had, everybody had their individual grievances up until then, but over that time they all got connected, and so people could see actually it wasn't just his village chief that had bulldozed his house and raped his daughter. It was the same thing had happened at the next village and the next village, and maybe there's actually something bigger going on. And so all these dots started to be connected together. People linked up with people with similar interests linked up all over the place. The power of truth began to really genuinely push back against the system in a way that had rarely happened before, perhaps arguably had never happened before. These were really subversive forces that were taking root in China, genuinely democratic forces, and economic empowerment was part of that too. Whatever the faults of the Chinese economy, in my view, it's a fact that it became a full employment economy, somewhere 5-8 years ago, and the result of that, the inevitable result of that, is workers for the first time in modern Chinese history had bargaining power. And so if you don't have to take it anymore when your boss, decides not to pay you for Chinese New Year, you can go and walk off to the next place. And these are very profoundly, I think, democratizing forces that we've taken root in China, and suddenly people are starting to talk in very similar terms as we hear civil society leaders talking in the rest of the world, particularly rule of law and truth. And out of that, somehow we've seen the new emperor of China. How did that happen? If you can just go forward one more. Sorry, just go back one. All right, so this is his presidential look. So how did it happen? And I'm going to wind it up fairly soon so I can open it up to question and answers. But really, he, as I alluded to in the beginning, how do you stamp authority in this system? You have to strike fear into the system. You have to have a form of, a mechanism of discipline, and this is not I don't think this is a model that applies to China, as a nation. I'm just talking about the political system, the elite. To inspire respect, you've got to show that you can follow through and that you're effective. And Xi Jinping began to do that with the trial of Bo Xilai. So the first half of last year, I was interviewing a whole bunch of elite families, people that knew Bo, people that knew Xi Jinping. A lot of them would say things like, "Oh, look, I don't like what Bo Xilai was doing, but isn't it terrible how they've denied him his own choice of lawyer? I believe in there's got to be some procedural justice in this thing. And they all found ways to show solidarity to Bo Xilai, even if they didn't agree with what he was doing. The point being is, you can't challenge the families. If you start to challenge the families, then none of us are safe. So I think that's why it was the single most important purge that Xi Jinping could do once he could destroy one of his own and do it, exceeding anybody's expectations with the full theatre. Nobody could say that Bo Xilai, Bo Xilai has had the most procedurally defensible trial in the history of modern China, and the result was everybody knew he was pretty crooked in various ways, or at least his family was. So allowed Bo Xilai to hang himself, so to speak, put him away in jail for a longer sentence than anybody imagined, shut up all the families. Before that, all the different revolutionary families had been kind of umbrellas for dissent. If whatever your views, you could express it under their protection. Since then, we've seen all of these guys become quiet, and as the purge has moved through the bureaucracy, I think we're having a similar. Well, I expect we're going to see a similar kind of result in various policy realms, as well as bureaucracies fall into line. All those difficult kind of policies of trying to kind of reduce pollution, of trying to reduce the reliance on heavy industry. All these things that vested interests were standing in the way of. It now becomes. You can now see how it's possible to overcome those barriers because of Xi Jinping's political acumen and his political strength. And I think that for a lot of that, he can thank his old friend Bo Xilai. Now, how are we going for time? Should I throw it open to questions? What would you like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a drink. Thanks very much, because I've got an important announcement to make, and that we wouldn't have this evening, it wouldn't have been possible without my friend Kerry Brown. Kerry Brown is the director of the China Study Centre, and many of the people in the audience have come from there. So at this point, Kerry is going to take over and monitor the questioning. Thank you very much, Kerry. Kerry is. Those that don't know Kerry, you should know that he's transformed the China Studies Centre at Sydney University. It's a very vibrant organisation now, and we're delighted that he's come along this evening and brought John with him so that we have this event. So from the rest of the evening, it's over to you, Kerry.
Great. Well, thank you.
I'm asked if you wouldn't mind going to the Bible.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's great to work with the Australian Institute of International Affairs. It's great to have John here. We often met in Beijing, and I think once at the Boao Forum, a delightful event a year ago. And so it's been an amazing oversight, overview of what you've seen in the last few years while you've been in China. So before I open it up, I have a question, and it's a very simple yes or no.
Yeah.
Is Zhou Yongkang going down?
Well, it's either him or Xi Jinping, and I'm going to back Xi Jinping on that one.
I think we can conclude from that John is on the right side of history. Great. Well, if I can open up for questions then. If you could say who you are, and I think we have a microphone, one microphone. I don't know quite how we're going to do this, but anyway, we'll get it to you eventually. So if I can start from we'll start from the back. So the gentleman up there, and then maybe take two at a time. So Tony Walsh.
Tony Welch, China Studies Centre, University of Sydney. John, one of the elements you traced is a kind of motif, in a sense, of your analysis, is the rise and fall of key families, and how, despite the persecution and suffering of a particular family, the next generation may rise yet again. So if you pursue that kind of logic, what do you think are the chances for Bo Xilai?
Let's take two at a time. Jing, jing.
My name is Qin Jin. I'm the director of the China Democracy Forum.
That isn't your thought patterns, is it?
I don't think so.
Okay, I just try to speak louder. Since you have been in China for that long time, do you see any sign of change, political change, under Xi Jinping?
In a way, they're not unrelated, those questions. So the future of Bo Xilai, can he ever get back into the system? And is there any hint, is there any glimmer of, I'm going to interpret your question to say, of political reform in China? Well, Bo Xilai is a fascinating guy, like his father, he grew up with an extraordinary sense of entitlement, and like his father, he felt like he also earned it. His old man, endured all that he did. In the Cultural Revolution, in a way, it was the ordeal. I don't know if any of you have read any Stalinist literature, but it's all about voluntary ordeals to conquer the cement mixer or whatever it is. And so Bo Xilai did that, and I think Bo Xilai saw himself in the same way. He had thrown himself against, I don't know much about English education, but I'm told that college he went to was pretty special at Oxford, and there is no way, it's not like the American kind, it's not like Harvard where you can just bribe your way in and get through. It's, you actually rise or fall on your merits. And so he, after having a little bit too much to drink for a couple of years and living in his presidential palace off campus, he made it through, and he did very well in, I think PE is the course you choose if you want to be a world leader. He did that one, and he made it. And he measured up against his colleagues at the Kennedy School at Harvard as well, with the qualification that I mentioned before. And quite seriously, actually, that's how I got in. So Bo Xilai had every reason to see himself in exactly the same terms that his father had. Obviously, Bo Xilai's world was turned upside down and spun around and smashed to pieces over the last year and a half. But so was his father's. At a very similar age. I think Bo Xilai was still in his thought reform jail when he was Bo Xilai's age today. So. He thinks he's got the goods. He's got a few things working against him. It didn't help that he didn't come out smelling of roses out of the trial of Bo Xilai. He's been officially tainted. It didn't help that his father appeared to dish him in that trial. It didn't help that his brother from the first marriage ended up inside the trial. Well, he was locked in California. The brother from the first marriage had been cast out of the family until now. Bo Xilai was cast out of the family. So he had a lot of ground to make up, but he's doing all the things you'd expect to do if you wanted to become president of China, and that is you'd go and do a law degree at Columbia University, you'd become a lawyer, you'd become the representative of a new kind of China, and then you'd try your luck in 10 or 15 years' time when China's a very different place. Will China be a very different place? Well, Xi Jinping is not giving any hint that that's what he plans to do. I personally don't rule it out. Now that's really just because there are people around him that have extraordinary faith. People that I like and trust doesn't make them right. But people that know Xi Jinping believe he is his father's son. That said, all that we've been able to see up to date is, I think it's a kick away the lifeboats strategy, that we're not going to even risk the thought of political reform. We're going to kick that lifeboat as far out of our reach, and so we're all going to keep this thing afloat, or we're all going to go down together. So that's, to date, been what we can see from Xi Jinping's political reform agenda.
Great. Maybe the Phoebe. And then one other, if there's anyone else. The lady down here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Phoebe Alexander, one of the councillor of Australian Institute of International Affairs. I would like to know that in your view, while you were in China, the internet has opened up. Now, that obviously has made a big difference in China. With the rise and the fall of Bo, internet played an important part, and also to the future of China, will internet continue to play an important part for the reform of China?
And then the lady just down here.
Hi, my name is Deborah Healy from the Faculty of Law at University of New South Wales. I'm particularly interested in marketisation and the role of state-owned enterprises. And I note that in the Congress last November and again a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of talk about that. But and you've talked about the changes in state-owned enterprises and their power. I'm particularly interested. It seemed to me in the commentary that I heard that despite they talk about marketisation, there's not very much dilution below 51% for those companies and their government ownership, and I thought I'd ask if you had any views on that.
Yeah, let me tackle that one first. So, having 51% outside shareholders in an SOE, that's not any sort of reform. What that is just a form of fundraising, capital raising. When you're not, I can guarantee you, there's no plans to delegate any power at all to those shareholders. That's been the model to date, and that would be the model in the scenario you talked about. So in the last 10 months, I've heard, and I was reporting a lot in the first half of last year about these very relatively radical reform plans that were being planned for the third plenum. I think they were radical in many ways, but the insights I had from the beginning, and as it turned out in the end, is marketisation with the great qualification is we're not going to destroy state-owned enterprises. So many in China would see that as completely mutually contradictory. If these guys can't go bust, if these guys are still given preferential capital and various administrative license, then that's not marketisation. Leaving the kind of the edges to everybody else is not marketisation. So the problem is for Xi is he's committed, I think, to two things. One is it's all under the rubric of regime preservation. So you need to have a more responsive, market-oriented economy if we're not going to see the Brezhnevization, as some of them talk about, of the Chinese economy. If you want to restore incentives and have proper, have investment that's directed to some extent to what consumers want to consume, then you've got to have economic reform. But state-owned enterprises are explicitly part of one of the pillars of regime preservation. So can you reconcile those two things? My guess is that they probably will be able to in the short term. There's so much other stuff you can do, around the edges. But this only postpones the inherent contradiction that people have been talking about all the time, and there's no plans anywhere to significantly diminish the power of state-owned enterprises. On the internet, Phoebe's question. So. Look, the internet, as I said before, it defined the changes that I saw in China over 6 years. Since September, we've seen the reverse happen. I'm not saying civil society has reversed at all, but whereas before it was this technology that was connecting people, that sphere of free expression and networking has significantly contracted. Almost impossible to think that anyone would be so bold as to think you can reverse the progress of the internet. Well, that's happened since September in a major way. The internet played a major role in the destruction of Bo Xilai in the sense that it was not possible to keep the truth in the black box like you could before. Lin Biao, it was 10 months before the average peasant realised that their number two leader, who was supposed to have taken over from Mao Zedong, was in fact a traitor who died in a plane crash in Mongolia 10 months ago. Bo Xilai, arguably, there were people on the net who found out before Hu Jintao is, although I would add that I had state security guys come up to me to challenge me on that point, and they said we had people at the gate watching who was going into the Chongqing embassy, and we got to Hu Jintao before the internet. I don't know if that's true. But completely different world. Can they actually control that process? Well, Xi Jinping's giving it a red-hot go. I think it's one of the great experiments of modern history to see if he can succeed.
Great. Maybe John, sorry, and then the guy in front. Yeah.
Joe Sprinsky from the United States Study Centre. Can I take you to your comments about sovereignty and the new push there? Richard Haas, when he was here a couple of weeks ago from the United States Foreign Relations Council, was asked what should Australia do about the spat between China and Japan about the islands. He made the observation you shouldn't take sides. His worry was that unlike the Cold War between Russia and America, where there were deep back channels which would serve to dampen down any particular incident on a frontier that might be led by a particular general, those back channels don't exist between China and Japan. And secondly, he felt the islands weren't really the issue. They're a provocation at the moment, but there's a deep-seated need by China to reassert itself from the wrongs it felt during the Second World War in Japan's hands, and watch the space for more such provocations.
Yeah, the gentleman.
Russell Lansbury, Industrial Relations, University of Sydney. John, there's been a rise for some time now in industrial unrest, and the all-China trade unions seem to be unable to do very much about this. But there is signs of change. What do you see the labour organisations having a role in the future? What role do you see them having?
Yeah, well, two very different questions. So, look, the labour institutions are, there's no such thing as a trade union in China. They're all branch offices of the Communist Party, but that's not to say that there's not a role for them to play. I think the game has changed. It's become in the age of competition for scarce labour, these organisations actually have a role to play in making the enterprise, the city, the municipality, the province more attractive than the next one. And so completely different to the role they played in the last 20 years, which was all about just shutting them up because you could afford to. Now it's actually finding channels for worker grievance and redressing some of those issues. So we're slowly at the margin seeing a more positive role being played by these party-controlled unions. They're not at all the leader of they're following the forces of economics rather than leading. And of course, when they do allow or organise any unrest, it's always the Walmart, the foreign investor rather than the local kind of Chinese champion. But at the margins they have a role, but I think it's only that. The sovereignty questions. So what's driving China in? Let me just sort of confine your question in the Senkakus, in the Diaoyus. Well, I think there's a bunch of things going on there. In the widest backdrop, it's very hard for a post-communist party to kind of they need another act. They need another trick, and so nationalism is the obvious one. That's been the obvious one of post-communist states. Around the place, it's the obvious one. Here, it's the most tempting thing to do. If you're not, it's a little bit difficult to explain that you're the Communist Party when your society is, according to the World Bank, the most unequal society in Asia, equal only with Nepal. So they've got to come up with another story, and that's the obvious one. And it's the only part of the founding story of the Communist Party that's still intact, and that was to rejuvenate the nation, to reclaim the lost grandeur, the strong nation, strong military story. So that's the one pillar that's intact. So of course they're going to build on it, and it's the easiest one to rally the people around the idea of a strong state. Why now? Why there? Well, why now? I think it's got everything to do with the rise of Xi Jinping. Personally, I've got reason to believe that he is very much behind a whole series of escalations of the East China Sea dispute. Most clearly seen as soon as Xi Jinping took over from the Central Military Commission, we started to see the first air incursions over Japanese-administered airspace ever, I think, and same with maritime as well. And that's for a couple of reasons. But I think in terms of the timing and why then, it's because, as one of Xi Jinping's family friends told me, with your generals, when they're all corrupt, when none of them know how to kind of steer their boats or their planes straight, let alone fight a war, and they're all beholden to other factional masters who they paid to get their posts. In her words, to sort the horses from the mules, you need to walk them around the yard. But why Stakakis? Why there? To the third part of this question. Well, I actually think that really there's one. I mean, there's no natural limit to how China defines its sovereignty. So there's no natural endpoint to this game. But if there's a focus to it, it's all about Taiwan. And if you can say that you claim the airspace, if you say that you can control the waters to the north of Taiwan, if you're creating trouble in the south, then lo and behold, people like Henry Kissinger, Hugh White, other people, very sensible people in some cases who have thought about this hard, start coming up with ideas as, why don't we just give them Taiwan, and then we'll kind of bring peace to the rest of the region. So I think that's a big part of the story.
Thank you. They must be looking at Putin at the moment and the incredible popularity he's got, and to thinking, interesting. Graduate of Harvard, Richard, and then the gentleman here.
I didn't drive my way there, but other people did. Richard Brunowski, the Vice President of this institute. John.
The author of that terrific book, by the way, thank you.
Thank you. Look, what do you think? I'll go straight to the point. Julie Bishop called in the Chinese ambassador to lecture him about declaring a unilateral zone of airspace. When she went to China, she had the unprecedented, I think, insult of not being talked to by the foreign minister. I don't know the exact details. Give us a thought. I'll speak without the mic. Tell me, what is your take on Australia's position? Are you with Hugh White to some extent, or do you think, from your perspective of being in China and so intensely involved in the domestic politics, can we separate the horses from the mules? What's happening? Where should Australia be?
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Yan Yu, and I'm from the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. I guess my question is somewhat related to John's question on territorial sovereignty and what Dr. Kerry Brown has touched on regarding Putin's popularity. That is, what do you think is the possible repercussions of the Crimean plebiscite on Chinese territorial ambitions? Not only regards Diaoyutai Island, but also Spratly and Paracel and the Arunachal Pradesh bordering India. And how can the West, led by the US, exploit the difference, exploit the weakness in the Sino-Russian strategic alliance, and how will Australia fit into this position?
So we're getting to the easy ones. So the Sino-China axis of convenience. Look, it's only kind of there for as long as Xi Jinping. It's a meeting of minds between two guys at the moment. That's the beginning and the end of the Sino-Chinese alliance. And if I was Xi Jinping and I was in a party that defined itself, as it always has, as being subverted and infiltrated by Western hostile forces wanting to peacefully evolve us, it would be nice to have a friend. A friend in need is a friend indeed. And according to Russian reports, Xi Jinping did nothing to upset Putin in his private phone call after it all. So his game is to, let's not antagonise the US over something which is not our fight. We've got much bigger things to fight about. But let's buy some capital with Putin for the political relationship, and I'm sure he's going to ask for it back in various ways. But perhaps when Putin goes to Beijing and finally gives up on his price plans for the gas pipeline into China. So it's a very kind of, it's not an alliance, it's a relationship of the moment, but a very important one given that 2 out of 5 countries on the permanent United Nations Security Council. So on the issue of sovereignty more general, look, you asked also about the Crimean annexation. very different traditions in Chinese military compared to Russian military. The Russians have a history of actually fighting wars with bullets and winning, and the Chinese don't. And I don't actually mean as a form of disparagement. It's more completely different. China, the Chinese Communist Party's defined itself by ducking every military engagement it could during World War II. But what it does very well is it's a political army. It's an army where the political commissars rule over the commanders, the general political department rules over the other departments, and the platforms which are just as important as the armaments department or the Navy or the Air Force are the outward-facing intelligence platforms, the United Front work, whether it's military or other institutions. They like to, there's a whole tradition which they hang on to very dearly about winning wars without actually having to fight bullets. And so it would be a disaster for China, and I think including in China's own eyes, if there was genuine live fire over any of these disputes, not least of which because you just see the instant coagulation of forces, of other countries against China. It would be disastrous, potentially disastrous economically as well. Far better to give the appearance of overwhelming military force while you've got Henry Kissinger telling you to give away Taiwan, and let's see what happens. If you can win back Taiwan, if you can kind of gain global acceptance for your by stealth sort of acquisition of the James Shoal or the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, and you haven't fought a war, you've ticked all the boxes, everybody's happy, you've got your territorial expansion, but without ever being called, but you can say, this is peaceful rise. In relation to the ADIZ, and which is linked to that question, what should Gillard do? Is this Australia's fight? Well, arguably it is Australia's fight. Probably half of Australia's exports get shipped through that bit of waterway, either on their way to Ruzhou or Qingdao or I don't know my Korean geography well enough. Or the ports of Japan and South Korea. They all go through that. It's everybody's territory. Does Australia, as a member of the region, have an interest in defining boundaries and saying what behaviour is acceptable and unacceptable? Absolutely, it does. The question is what to do about it. Was this the fight we should have picked? Now, I don't actually have a strong view on that, except to say that. As I was running around Canberra kind of telling as many people as I could, make sure you've got a list on Tony Abbott's kind of whiteboard. These are the 10 landmines that are going to go off, in random order over the next 2 months. I hope you've worked out which ones you want to actually fight, because now that this is the single most dominant economic partner that Australia's ever had since our colonisers kind of were still buying our butter and our wool 50, 60 years ago, you can't just spend political capital for no result. You've got to pick your battles. Was this a little bit, did we kind of aim too high? The worst thing I think you can do is to make a big noise and then back down and show not only, can you make an ass of yourself on the diplomatic stage, but when they kind of, shout back, then you go to water. We don't actually know what's been going on behind the scenes. All I can say is, China's very complicated. There's lots of opportunities. There's lots of challenges. I hope that whatever the plan was, that it was thought through.
Maybe just two final ones. So I think Didi, yeah. Already answered or no? Yeah, Scott. So Scott, and then Feng Chongyi. Okay, so yeah. From the organisation of the colonisers, the British Consulate General.
The British Consulate first of all, thank you for a very thought-provoking address. I was going to ask you a question on the Crimea, but I think you've largely answered that, so can I ask a substitute one, which is, and every time you have a new leader in China, there is a purge of some kind. Hu Jintao went against the sort of Shanghai set, so what do you think is fundamentally different about this purge, if you want to put it in those terms, than previous ones that have happened?
Yes, Feng Chongyi from Shanghai Research Center, UTS. how big is the power base of Xi Jinping? Is that a real chance for him to become a political strongman?
Yeah, great question. I think the guy's a phenomenon. He's got no base as such except for this loose understanding amongst revolutionary children. I think Cheng Li at Brookings is still writing about the Jiang Zemin faction owning the Standing Committee 6-1, at a time when all the big hitters of the Jiang Zemin faction of the past Standing Committee are in jail. So what we're seeing is an attempt at a post-factional world. Now, you could, if you draw all the dots between all the people that go down, they're all on Jiang Zemin's side of politics. They're all on his father's enemy's side of politics, actually. But why was that? I think it's because actually they're the guys that had all the money. They were the ones that are having all the fun. As one of your friends, George Singh, once told me, that when he realised that the Communist Youth League didn't even have enough confidence to pay bribes, then he knew that Hu Jintao was in trouble. So the money was on the other side, the political resistance was on the other side, that's the Jiang Zemin side. Xi Jinping was elevated by the Jiang Zemin side, and he turned around and started spraying bullets into what people thought was his own side. I think it's just phenomenal. You can't do that if the whole team knows that you're going after them one by one. All you can do is lead them through the gate and form new coalitions against one of them, this little cluster, and before you know it, they're all kind of locked up in pens. So that's the way he's done it, with no factional base of his own. He was pulled up by others, not standing up on his own platform. But now, could you see anybody challenging him now, like Hu Jintao was challenged throughout the whole time of his tenure? I would argue, not to say it's all kind of home and hosed, but once you've got Zhou Yongkang and Xu Caiho, there's the guys that controlled all the guns in China over the last 5 years, and I think you're in a pretty strong position. Now what have I missed, Scott?
I would just say there's been purges throughout Chinese history, so
why is this different?
Yeah.
Look, there was the purges under. Look, I think purging is actually an essential part of Chinese politics. It dates back to Stalin, and that is that the way he kind of can laugh at the language. It's about the restoration of the bourgeoisie, within of capitalism within the party. You can laugh about that, but in this system where there is only vertical relationships of power, when there is no downward accountability, that it calcifies. If you don't have purges, you get Brezhnev. And so you've actually got to smash the system to stop it from calcifying. And I think Xi Jinping and his comrades, his revolutionary children that he grew up with, understand that very deeply. I don't think they appreciated it in 1970, 66 and onwards. But once they've seen what happens in the absence of it, when power and money are absolutely fused together, when bureaucracy is controlled, when the tail wags the dog, I think there was actually a bit of a consensus that they have to do something. It's got to be brutal, but they just prefer that, just not me. It is different.
Great, well, thank you very much. I think we have to really acknowledge the great help that John has given over the last few years, based in Beijing and then back here, in explaining the mysteries of Chinese politics, and by looking very closely at the people. I mean, it's not like they're from another planet, although I wonder about Hu Jintao, but that's another issue for another day. But they obviously have a history, a back history, and really very few people have done as much as John in explaining where they came from and where they are now, and therefore where they're likely to go. So I think in giving us that narrative, I mean, we wouldn't expect to have American politics or European politics explained in a kind of such a mysterious way. And so really, I think for journalists like John particularly, they have helped us understand politics in China in a way that isn't really something that's happened in the past. So tonight we've seen a masterclass in that, so it's wonderful to have had you. Thank you very much, and thank you to Colin for having me.
This has also been, inextricable from his rise to power. Now that he's got the tiger head sort of sitting on a post of all these various tigers, which petrol company or bank would kind of or provincial leader will disregard central orders now in a way that they've kind of happily done over the last 10 years. So we're in a new era. I think if there's one defining trait about the new guy, Xi Jinping, it is that he is a guy that's not afraid to take risks. He's a guy that's actually not even afraid to fail, which is a completely different political mindset to what we saw before, for all sorts of various reasons, which I'll go into. So now I've kind of given you the answer. I'll try and let you know how I got there. Now, have I got a little pointy thing? All right, cool. So there's the dictator as a young boy, Xi Jinping, and his old man Xi Jinping. So these guys were rehabilitated in 1978. That's just after they got. Xi Jinping had spent most of his life in purgatory at that stage. Now they're into the new world of opening and reform. I'll just touch another screen. Thank you. That's my kind of my working summary of where we're at. He is a stickler for process, for party process. This, as distinct from various other processes, this means that you inherit the policy platform that you nut out with your predecessors. He walked in. He walks onto the job the day after the 18th Party Congress. It's the 18th Party Congress, the old mob, that lays out the policy platform. He's been implementing that as it was given to him, with the difference being that he's done it, more, he's done it with kind of steroids and jet fuel and various other kind of growth supplements. He's just doing it far harder and faster, these various programs that were going nowhere before, for better or for worse. This is not a moral judgment, this is just a judgment that whatever his task is to do, he's starting to get it done. His first task is I think to restore some sort of belief. They use the word faith often. It's almost a religious thing. Dating all the way back to Yan'an, you don't believe in really an outcome, you believe in an entity, and you believe that it's going to keep rising, and his job first and foremost is to restore faith that the party is always going to be in charge of China, and China, with the party in control, is inexorably rising. And so anybody that hasn't jumped on board, you know where the good money is going to be. Part of that is territorial. I'll leave this for the question and answer afterwards. I'm really looking forward to that. But part of it is territorial, that he's not changing priorities, but he's doubling the stakes and tripling the time frame, sort of accelerating the time frame in which he's trying to achieve territorial, in their words, the reclamation of ancient Chinese claims in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and potentially elsewhere. He's deepening sovereignty also in other borderlands, and incredibly accelerated timetable in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang and Tibet. It's a very nebulous thing. The idea of a Chinese state is a very nebulous thing and potentially extends into Chinese communities elsewhere. So this extends into the economic field too. Again, I won't go into my projections, but if there's risks to be taken for the goal of regime preservation, then he's the guy that I think is going to take them. So how did they get there? Well, it begins really with the fact that these guys were brought up tougher than any politician that we've ever been familiar with. These are the guys who, Xi Jinping was, he was born in 53. Xi Jinping is 13 years old when he's watching his old man being paraded around on the back of a truck. This one's in Xi'an, so the kids were in Beijing. But Xi Jinping was kidnapped from his factory where he was doing thought reform through labour. In Henan province, he was taken by Red Guards to Xi'an. He was put in front of a whole bunch of of criticism sessions, big wooden, sometimes metal racks around his head, head thrust forward, arms forced backwards, sometimes dislocated, and all sorts of abuse being thrown at you, and much worse going on behind closed doors. I mean, one of my really more surprising discoveries as I researched these guys is, we actually don't know the half of it. We think of the Cultural Revolution as being about, the public throwing a few tomatoes, and really the worst happened behind closed doors. It was a not as dissimilar as people think to the Stalin's Great Terror in 1930s Russia, and Xi Jinping went through all of that, but the difference to some of his compatriots is he fell earlier. So the whole family fell very early in the piece, 3 or 4 years before the Cultural Revolution proper, and that was Xi Jinping's entire formative experience. It was being smashed, humiliated, himself, his mother, his father, his siblings, his elder sister assumed when I first arrived. Now, I left in mid last year, and I think that was still probably, my assessment when I left, but I think political time in China started pretty much, T0 from about September last year, and as they say in the mob, you're not really a leader until you've killed. And when Xi Jinping took care of Bo Xilai in September last year, I think that really was the beginning of a new era in Chinese politics. I've touched the mic again, I'm really sorry, whoever it is. He stepped forward after destroying Bo Xilai. The way he did it set up really his ascendency. He showed his colours. Lots of people, except really, families that knew him well, were saying, look, all we can do is guess who he is because of who his father was. And lots of people had a lot of confidence in various ways because of that. But he'd never shown his colours really until September last year. All of a sudden, he walked onto the stage. He not only took down Bo Xilai kind of harder than people had expected, he began dismantling the world's biggest, baddest company, PetroChina, the world's biggest, baddest security apparatus run by Zhou Yongkang, and now we see even the former vice chairman of the Central Military Committee who controlled the PLA for 10 years, Xu Caiho, and various others. Up until that stage, I'd never seen a corruption campaign that was actually directed at corruption rather than various kind of politics. But this, he bridged the two. His corruption campaign has, if I was to kind of nominate my list of, the biggest, baddest, worstest guys in China, he's pretty much taken down most of them, and the others are pinned against the wall.
Beijing correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age, and a very distinguished one he was too. And he's shortly going to return to North Asia for the Fairfax newspapers, which is really good news for those of us who've seen some of the foreign coverage in those papers sort of falling away a bit. So we're delighted, John, that you're going back there, and we're really delighted that you're here tonight to join us. And so, John Garnaut.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure and a privilege. Look, I don't know if I'm going to get to Northeast Asia, as Colin suggested. It depends on how Fairfax's share price goes over the next few weeks. I'll be based in Melbourne and hopefully do a little bit of travelling, but trying to broaden my interest in China to the region. So, look, I spent 6 years in China as correspondent for. Hands off the mic. Oh, sorry, it's not my mic. I shouldn't have touched it. So I spent 6 years in Beijing, and the story that I was discovering, and it's not what I set out to discover, was really the putrefaction of the Chinese party state. It was the corruption that was actually corroding how power worked. It It was a system that's designed for dictators when there was no dictator. It was bureaucracies driving the centre. It was an organism without a nucleus. It was something much messier and much, I think, less stable than I had